Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr.
Governor Carlos Lacerda has during most of his life opposed first the landowning plutocrats who dominated Brazil, then Getúlio Vargas, the semi-fascist dictator, subsequently Kubitschek, and Quadros and Goulart, and now Costa y Silva. He has been the governor of Guanabara province and is credited with the near miraculous recovery of Rio, which as governor he administered. But mostly he is known in his own country as an orator, a disputatious editor, a relentless enemy. When President Vargas was accosted with the evidence that one of his own bodyguards, in collusion with one of his own children, attempted to assassinate Mr. Lacerda after an inflammatory television broadcast, President Vargas withdrew upstairs and shot himself, either in expiation or in embarrassment, or for both reasons. Mr. Lacerda, who greatly opposed the leftism in the Quadros government and in the successor governments of Goulart, has nevertheless now withdrawn his support from the military who dominate Brazil, withdrawn it on the grounds of its undemocratic character. It is this subject we hope to probe, the question whether democracy in Brazil, particularly, and indeed elsewhere in Latin America, has proved at least substantially unsuccessful, and whether under the circumstances the fight for democracy is the most important fight being made in Latin America by decent and progressive folk. Specifically, Mr. Lacerda, did you support the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Brazil, Mr. Goulart?
Well, yes, I did. For a certain time, we believed that we had a democratic government when we did elect by smash and vote President Quadros, who got the absolute majority in a program. And when he did resign, his program was over. And the vice president, who was elected on the opposed ticket by a very thin majority, became president. In other words, it's like electing Governor Reagan and Vice President Bob Kennedy, or vice versa, and all of a sudden you get rid of one and you had the opposite. So there was a sense of frustration in the country, and President Goulart was called by the military a liability to national security. Well, he came on anyway, because we tried to have law and order and continuity of the democratic process. But it seems to me that was a sort of collective political suicide in the whole body of government, because they started doing such an agitation in the country that it seemed that the whole thing was going to pieces and falling apart. Then when the military decided to intervene and try to establish law and order, every one of us supposed that we're just going to call elections as it was supposed by law and by general consensus they should. Well, it seems that they were a little tired of intervening and putting law among the politicians, and then they substituted them. And they have now a sort of a hybrid regime who certainly does not, cannot be classified as democratic.
Well, you see, my confusion, and I think the confusion of a lot of Americans, has really to do with this. Those of us who have who are sort of familiar with your career know that you have very consistently supported freedom. But in the course of supporting freedom, you sometimes are in favor and sometimes not in favor of people who have been democratically elected. So the question arises, what are the theoretical circumstances under which you pull away from democracy because you feel that freedom is the substantial alternative?
True. But the question is that in these countries, you cannot speak of freedom in an abstract sense. Freedom is connected with lots of things, such as food, such as education, and such as real freedom for all, and not only freedom for those who are in power. In other words, we are a little tired of this formal aspects and just juridical aspects of democracy. Sometimes people even despise too much these aspects, which of course I do respect and cherish. But still I think that formality is not a good way of judging the values of a democratic regime.
Well, I agree. I agree. But I think it's extremely important for Americans to understand more clearly than at least this American understands the extent to which, quotes, democracy is the number one in your hierarchy of values. Mm-hmm. Now, for instance, would you have backed Premier Salazar when he took power in Portugal in 1927?
No.
You would not have?
No. I'm a great admirer of his genius. I think he's a great political writer. He is perhaps the great written orator in Portuguese language of all times.
Greatest what?
A great speaker.
Uh-huh.
But he's a man of convictions. He's a servant of his country. He does what he thinks is better for his country. But he is deprived of the gland of freedom.
No, well,
he doesn't care about that. Freedom for him is but a luxury that some may afford and some not.
Yes, but this is something that you know now. But in 1927, I'm asking, because
7 I was in school. It was too.
Yes, but I wouldn't be embarrassed to ask you a question about 447 BC, because I know that you know what happened then too. The reason I bring this up is because it seems to me that it's an interesting parallel. We had a lot of American professors, for instance, who worked themselves up into a considerable lather on the question of overthrowing Goulart. Now, as I understand, you supported the overthrowing Goulart, just the way a lot of people supported overthrowing of Salazar's successor, assuming that one could identify a successor of Salazar. They came and went about as fast as they could be shot. But now I'm asking you to please explain to us what is your criterion, and the criterion presumably of other well-educated Latin Americans, on the question of when should democracy yield.
Well, now I see your point, and perhaps I can answer it, or clarify, or try to. The question is, when a government abuses of its own rights and go beyond the law.
Who decides?
That's, again, general consensus.
How do you establish a
consensus? For instance, let's face the facts there, and perhaps that will help the understanding of
Is this a numerical consensus, the majority of the people?
It should be. It should be.
But the fact that the majority of the people were in
plebiscite on illegal acts.
No, but the fact that the majority of the people were in favor of Perón continuing in power wouldn't have put you in favor of Perón continuing in power, would it?
No.
So therefore you're prepared to be with the minority even against the consensus.
Well, that's a very difficult question. In fact, yes.
And
We'll continue with William F. Buckley, Jr. and his guest in just a moment. For instance, I
I'm not speaking of law in terms of the law as written, but in terms of institutional existence, functioning. For instance, in the case of President Goulart, basically everybody was interested in his staying in power until the end. Everybody. But President Kubitschek was candidate for re-election and needed his support. At least he thought so. I was candidate for election, and I wanted an election. Yeah. Besides my personal conviction, even from personal career.
But it was widely assumed you would be president in '64.
If he was going on his government, I believe the majority would be on my side.
Yeah.
But then, for instance, when sailors start leaving their battleships and going to headquarters of political groups and cursing their admirals and calling them reactionaries, lackeys of American imperialism. When corporals of military police and the army start dividing the generals between 2 or 3 generals that they considered generals of the people, and the other generals were calling brass lackeys of the State Department. If you like or not, if one believe or not that an armed force should exist, one must agree that since it does exist, it is based on discipline and hierarchy. And these fellows could not exist anymore if they allow this thing to go on. The workers were invited every day to go on a general strike for political reasons. They refused, they never got in.
By whom?
But by the government.
Mm-hmm. In protest against whom?
In protest against Congress. And Congress was under the menace of being closed if they did not agree on giving the laws that they were asking for.
You know, your excuse for helping to overthrow a democratically elected government is that there was, in effect, paralysis in government. Is that correct?
No. Well, we'd even go a little further. What we would challenge is the expression democratic elected government. Because actually we very seldom have a democratic elected government.
Why
in
is
these
that?
countries. It's a sort of a fiction that we all agree in order to try to improve their conditions, the conditions under which they go on. We try hard to live under democratic rule, but we actually know that there is no such thing as a democratic rule to abide for.
Well, is this something that you find it very difficult to communicate in America?
It is.
To, for instance, fashionable members of the Academy who are always talking about the necessity to increase Latin American democracy?
Well, since you mentioned that, sometimes I'm afraid that in your academic world, people have now a tendency to leave the academic language and the academic commitment and start using labels and generalities, such as, for instance, when some people judge the role of the army in these countries. They say, the army. Which one? What part of it? Which group in it?
They say,
the church. Yeah. And then I read it. They say, the church is now have a tendency towards the left or the right. And I am always very much afraid of these expressions, left and right. You are using it in the United States after Europe got rid of it. Mm-hmm. They just export it as a sort of a ideological surplus vocabulary.
No, but I think it. I see your point, but I think it is true, isn't it, that there seems to be an American commitment to, quote, democratic institutions. When you see, for instance, the whole moral architecture of the Alliance for Progress, the whole notion was that it was necessary to stimulate democracy in Latin America, because unless you had democracy, you had a polarization in wealth, the wealthy and the poor, and you invited social conditions which in turn invited communism. Now, there are people who are quite adamant about this in America, who insist that no government in Latin America that is undemocratic ought to have the sanction of the United States. Now, you do disagree with that, I understand. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. And I would try to clarify this point too. I think when too much emphasis were put in this question of people being rich and people being poor, and what I'm going to say is not a very undebatable thing. I know that it's submitted to debate. I think far more important is to prepare a program and to vision a situation in which our people will be more educated. I mean, get more education. The fact that a few are rich and many are poor is a second fact. I mean, is a subproduct of a society in which education is not available for all. In other words, the equal opportunities for all are more important than how much each one earns per month. Because this is a consequence.
So therefore
you cannot democratize society until we reach a point in which everyone has an opportunity for education.
Well, then you would not object to a despotism in your own country, provided you
Yes,
were convinced. Wait a minute.
Yes,
wait a minute. Provided you were convinced that under that despotism, those goals that you desired, namely freedom, opportunity, education, were being accelerated at the fastest conceivable speed.
No, because I don't believe despotism will always ever do that. Because, you know, despotism has this very difficult thing and very dangerous thing. They start liking it.
Well, I wasn't talking about the perils of despotism. I said, would you back a
They become
despotism for so
addicted to
long as it was doing that? You know, John Stuart Mill, you remember,
sure.
said that he was in favor of despotisms when it could be shown
Yes, but
that those despotisms were engaged in that kind of thing.
Were a different thing. Now with television, communication media, and all the weapons that despotism has, since you get it, you don't get rid of it.
All right. Then can we agree on the following generality, that you would oppose a despotism even if the alternative to it were a democratically sustained government whose activities were such as Perón's?
No, I would oppose the alternative.
Well,
Why should we choose between two evils? Why shouldn't we try to find another way?
Well, I think one should, but I think that
And in Perón,
maybe
in Perón you have the alternatives combined. You have a democratic trend.
After this message, we'll return to William F. Buckley, Jr.
Democratic picture in a despotic frame.
Well, but it seems to me that in Latin America, and specifically in Brazil, you've got a situation in which progress is difficult for a number of reasons. The birth rate, for instance, the illiteracy rate, 50%, the rate of inflation, 41% during the current year, an enormous amount of demagogy, a sort of a utopianism which sees, for instance, the creation of Brasilia at a moment when there seems to be no obvious advantage for injecting $600 million into that, let's say, rather than a greater, more education or a better farm system. But what one doesn't know is the extent to which in Brazil a government, because it is democratically democratically baptized is considered sacred, or the extent to which a government is supposed to perform certain things, and that it is more important what it performs than what its provenance was.
I would say that both things are important. To perform such things without a meaning is to condemn it to derision and to failure. You mentioned several aspects. Let me mention a positive aspect there. I think, for instance, I was and I'm still a critic of the Brasilia thing. I rather like much better the roads around Brasilia than Brasilia itself. Still, there is a positive aspect of it. It gave a confidence to the people, I mean, a sense of accomplishment. I believe you agree with me that when a people is injected or impregnated with optimism and start believing in its own capacity, in its own creativity, in its own capacity for overcoming obstacles, they can perform prodigious things. I believe if a government comes that gives to the people the opportunity for education and give them a sense of accomplishment, and also a sense that they are trying to build up together a common work and going towards a common ground, namely a common country for them. I believe they will accomplish many things in just a few years. For instance, we never built a car, an automobile. We never built an automobile in Brazil. In 5 years, with the same fellows who were farm hands until then, we now are in the 7th place in the world as car makers. I don't care so much about making cars. I'm trying to emphasize, to call your attention on the fact that these same people were farm hands in a sort of mining agriculture, in the most primitive agriculture. In 5 years, they became skilled workers.
Well, okay. Why don't we agree then that there is much too much emphasis on the nature of formal political institutions, that it doesn't matter. For instance, Mexico is widely thought of as a democratic country. It really isn't by Platonic standards, is it?
I believe Plato will not be very happy about it.
Yeah. Well,
it seems that way.
Well,
but he's not Mexican.
No. No, what I should have said is that you never hear any criticism in America about democracy in Mexico, because what happens in Mexico, as you know, is that every 5 years they go through a vast national charade, and they very carefully cultivate about 8, 9, 10% dissident votes, so as to be able to go through the illusions of democracy. Whereas, for instance, by contrast, in Venezuela, during the days of Pérez Jiménez, he didn't go through that charade, and so we were very anti-Venezuelan, very pro-Mexico. Now, would you say that the United States should or should not adopt the line that seemed to have been adopted by the Kennedy administration, namely that we will withhold support from those countries in Latin America that do not fulfill the idea of democracy according to our paradigm? And
I think it's your privilege.
You do? Well, do you think that it is correct, as for instance Mr. Schlesinger said or Mr. Goodwin has said, that we have lost a lot of sympathy in Latin America because we have, quotes, played along with the military juntas and the reactionary regimes? Do you think it's right that, as for instance was said by some professors when Goulart was deposed, that we were going to lose the sympathy of the Brazilian people in virtue of our collaboration in his
Let's try
withdrawal?
to clarify that. You are a very dangerous man, Mr. Buckley, because you have a power of logic that goes beyond logic itself. Let's come back to horse logic. I wouldn't ever say that Mr. Goodwin and Mr. Schlesinger were not right when they said so. Still, I would agree that in the beginning, the decision of President Johnson to recognize the new administration in Brazil after the overthrow of Goulart was wise and correct. The trouble is that after it, the regime in Brazil was so submissive to the Washington rule, so obedient to instructions on how to rule the country, and so unpopular inside the country, not only because they were fighting inflation, which is not a matter for popularity, of course, but also because of the way they were doing it. That actually, when President Marshal Castelo Branco left government, he left a residue, he left a heritage of unpopularity that covers both the Army and the United States. So if Mr. Goodwin and Mr. Schlesinger were not precisely correct in their first approach, facts later on proved that they have foreseen correctly.
But they couldn't.
In other words,
they couldn't have done those
nowadays
facts, right?
America in Brazil is really unpopular.
It
I
is.
think that was not true before. Before it was just a.
We're interrupting now, but momentarily we'll be back to William F.
very
Buckley
small
Jr.
minority.
And what was it that made it?
Conservative people as well as liberal radicals, all in a sort of an unanimous, if not just, but almost unanimous condemnation of this policy was actually imposed by the military, but with some sort of approval of the American authorities.
Well, now,
And I think this was
this is very
basically
interesting.
wrong.
What should America have done?
Nothing.
Nothing. I tend to agree with you.
When an American friend of mine asked that question, what could we do? I usually say, don't overdo.
Well, but we had to recognize or not recognize the new regime, right? We couldn't do nothing.
Well, actually, there was no point in recognizing. I think it was a little bit
Premature.
exaggerated because this was an internal affair, and the Congress elected the president. So we saved the face of our face and the United States face towards the State Department. So there was no problem in Washington to be solved, it seems to me. It was a little overdoing on this.
Well, in other words, you say that we should have recognized, but not enthusiastically. We had sort of a tonal problem. Is that
That's
it?
a good way to put it.
Yeah, sort of reluctantly.
Yeah. Reluctant agreement.
And in the case of
And
Peru
wait
under
and
Kennedy,
see. And wait and see.
Yeah.
What was really bad for both of us, for Americans and Brazilians alike, is that to some business groups in Brazil, this coup was taken as a sort of a year-round Santa Claus. They took for granted that Brazil was saved from communism. Dunque, it was their paradise.
yeah.
It was their jubilee. And it should not be taken that way. And they should not go into a too conservative and orthodox financial policy. They should remember that the country cannot stop in the sacred name of having a safe currency. We
Okay,
should combine
okay.
currency with development.
All right, but let me just tie this up now.
Yes.
Is it your recommendation that the United States recognize any de facto government in Latin America?
I think there is no permanent rule about this.
Oh, that's
I
the
think
trouble,
they should-
yeah. I was afraid you were going to say that. If there's no permanent rule, suppose you give me examples of governments that we shouldn't have recognized.
Well,
Obviously,
for instance,
Castro would be obvious,
Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti.
We should not recognize.
You should,
Okay.
you should
Don't recognize
retreat
Papa Doc.
from recognizing.
And Castro, obviously. Now, who else should we not recognize?
Well, it's not to me for me to make that list, Mr.
But you're not
Buckley.
running for president here tonight. No, seriously,
Well,
because
for the time being, I don't see any other that should
you
be
don't. All right.
recognized.
Now, was President Kennedy incorrect?
But of course,
in
excuse me,
declining
I would
to
like to point
recognize
out
the
this.
government of Peru after the putsch in 1961?
No,
was it?
actually, it was irrelevant because actually they managed themselves, and I think it's very,
No, but
very
at first he
difficult
didn't
for a country
recognize.
not to recognize.
All
Anyway.
right. So do you desire to take the occasion to dissociate yourself from those Americans who say that the United States ought not to recognize undemocratic governments in Latin America?
I think it's not for the United States to decide.
Well, it's certainly for us to decide who to recognize, isn't it?
Yes, I mean,
You said we shouldn't recognize Papa
as
Doc.
long as this is my personal opinion, because
you're
I
here to
don't
express your
like
personal
his
opinion,
regime. That's different. But I mean, analyzing it from a serious and not so personal point of view, I would say that as long as a regime proves to have a certain condition of durability, of stability, and of internal acceptance, internal acceptance.
Well, how much internal acceptance? Perón had plenty of internal acceptance. Didn't
Yes, he had. That's the trouble.
he? Well,
Modern tyrants are not very unpopular, as you know.
Well, I guess then that you're willing to say that you neither want to associate yourself with nor dissociate yourself with the general theoretical argument that goes on in the United States, about which, incidentally, a lot of tempers flare, because, for instance, of the Dominican Republic, there was very, very considerable excitement on the question of whether or not we should recognize the successor government to that which had voted in...
The Dominican Republic incident, to me, is up to now a riddle, enigma. I cannot decipher this thing. I knew from the papers in Brazil that we were about to send troops to help the Dominicans to get rid of a preventive invasion, to get rid of a menace of a communist dictatorship, or let us say of a dictatorship was not clearly defined. Well, the least I can say is that since they were there, they could at least go on the neighborhood in the same island and put Papa Doc out. I think it's for the same basic reasons. Why should they retreat instead of finishing the job since they did start it?
Because you believe that the United States should use its...
I'm just joking.
Oh, you are? I see.
But I'm not joking when I say that I didn't see up to now the reason for the invasion of the Dominican Republic. And this I'm very serious. I think that, tiny and weak as it may be, any republic has a right to live on their own and not to be invaded by other troops under the coverage or the pretext or even the motivation that they are trying to prevent that country to be communist or what else.
It may be wise to avoid this, since there seems to be considerable factual disagreement over whether or not those conditions existed which justified our going into the Dominican Republic, with reference to a general understanding that we have on mutual defense. Now, is it then your position that the United States ought or ought not to enter into treaties with Latin American countries to go to the defense of any single Latin American country in the event that we have an appeal from the legitimate government?
Yes. Treaties, yes. I don't see any reason to make an international permanent force.
And do you think we would be justified in...
These treaties exist, as you know.
I know, yes, I know. Do you think that we would be justified in going into Cuba? and eliminating the
I think
communist
the
government?
the time has passed. In the beginning, it would have some and good reasons.
Would that have been
for it.
popular with Brazilians?
It would be, provided
Would have been
the
or would be?
Quadros, who was publicly against, but he put it to me once. He said, provided it is successful and quick enough.
Yeah.
I think the worst thing...
More to
about
come, and we'll return to William F. Buckley, Jr. immediately.
He's a very bright student from Rutgers University, Governor.
Please.
Sir, I think we need a mic handed over there.
Sir, you stated that you said that the United States should not differentiate between a despotic or a democratic government in the Alliance for Progress as long as it promoted stability and the welfare of the people. Well, wouldn't such a... Well, if it was a despotic regime, wouldn't it have to be extremely benevolent in order to comply with the democratic ideals of the Alliance for Progress?
Well, I think I did not make myself very clear. I'm not saying that the American people should not differentiate. What I'm saying is that it's not for the American government to make differences between that, because sometimes what a government here may consider a despotic regime may not be considered as such by their own people. In other words, it's not for any nation to be the judge of the other nation acceptance by their own citizens. So I think there are many other ways of disapproving it. And if we didn't think so, how could the UNO exist? How could the United Nations exist, since they have so many regimes there represented that are so evidently despotic?
Could you give us an example of a country you have in mind, for instance, in Latin America, that is sort of disapproved of by us, but you think is approved of by its own constituency?
No, I don't know of any, but we are discussing in theory.
Yeah.
Is figuring an example. No, I don't know of any, actually.
Mm-hmm. Is there another? Yes, this gentleman over here.
But I mean this, if you allow me, I'll just try to clarify this. There was a time in which the expropriation of an American business group in Latin America did develop in the Senate the so-called Hickenlooper Amendment that prevented America to lend any amount of money to any country in which there was an expropriation outside of law.
You're opposed to that?
This is a right that the Americans have, and I don't challenge that. So let's make a difference between political recognitions and the right that Americans have to lend money or refuse to lend money to this or that government. This is different.
Well, did you think it might have been wise if the United States had passed the Hickenlooper law? That is to say, might that have encouraged a certain restraint in Latin American governments sufficient to permit an increased flow of capital?
No, because I also would say that any government is entitled to their own initiative. I think Perhaps some government in Latin America would say we prefer to go this way instead of getting loans. So it's up to you and up to them. That's the point I'm trying to make.
There's a question, I think.
How committed was the American government, or do you know how committed the American government was to the overthrow of Goulart? For example, I was on a destroyer at the time which raced towards Brazil at the news of the revolution, and when it received news that the revolution was successful, came round and came back to port, went as far as the equator. From
There
Norfolk.
was a lot of talk about it. Just recently, a book has been printed in this last events by an American professor who is liberal, and he concludes that there is no definite evidence of anything.
Of any what?
Of any interference of American authorities whatsoever in the preparation of the overthrow of Goulart. Of course, on the Goulart side, especially on the Brizola side, with his brother-in-law, is the most radical wing of his supporters. And now they disrupt, and Brizola is fighting Goulart. There are many accusations of it, but I have not the slightest proof. What I have is different, and I think it's serious enough, is that certain groups of the business community, American business community, took for granted that this overthrow of Goulart meant for them a certain privilege in getting certain advantages of this new regime. This, it seems to me, is far more important than the idea of a conspiracy of the CIA to overthrow Goulart or anybody else. I think there are two idiocies that we should fight to, or at least we should refuse to abide to, is the right idea of the conspiracy on the left and the leftist idea of a conspiracy of the right. I think it's about time to get rid of it and try to analyze logically and coldly facts and not just ghosts of facts. Yes, that's what we try to do. I would like to emphasize this. There is not the slightest evidence of interference. But of course, I believe the American authorities there and here were pretty happy when that thing happened, which is also their privilege.
So were you.
So were I.
So
was I. So I think it's their privilege to smile if something good for them happens.
Discreetly.
What is really serious is what happened after it. The growing discontent, the growing disappointment, the fact that sometimes, Mr. Buckley, you and other people in several points of the political spectrum have criticized the State Department. I renounced to it.
You what?
I resigned to the idea of criticizing the State Department of Latin American policy. And for a good and simple reason, is that because the State Department doesn't have a policy.
Well, I gather
they changed so much. They changed from Tom Mann, who did believe 100% in private initiative as the only and sole way of solving problems down there.
I gather from
to other fellows who are more or less, let's say, socialistic in their general approach, that actually they, as one correspondent put it, they just react to incidents.
But I gather from the last 30 minutes that this is what we ought to do, is to have no policy on Latin America.
No, sir.
Simply to view
we
things
were
ad hoc.
discussing. No, you didn't get me this time. We were just discussing recognizance of governments.
Yeah.
We were not discussing a permanent policy. Exactly what I'm trying to say is that you need a permanent policy. Alliance for Progress ought to be. But after that crisis of leadership that goes on in the continent, if I cannot say in the world, the thing is that he has lost momentum, it has lost inspiration, has lost...
After this message, we'll return to William F. Buckley, Jr.
a sort of a financing of specific projects like any big bank would do, if it was proper for them to do, it was profitable. On the other hand, as elections come here, there is an old game of American politicians is to go to their voters in the Midwest and say, let's stop this giveaway program. And they try to convince their voters that if they are re-elected, they will never more vote for aid to foreign nations. And then they start cutting it. This is a typical pre-election bonus.
Yeah, but just think of all the extra coffee we drink during election years. I think there's a question over here, Governor.
I'd like to get away from the external forces affecting Brazil for a moment. Mr. Lacerda, what is exactly the role of middle class in Brazil?
If it's
It does. There is a book by Professor Johnson from Stanford on it.
If it's so polarized between the elite and the impoverished, by going against a democratically elected regime in the very beginning, aren't you really planting a seed for further revolution? If the differences are so polarized that there is no middle class there?
No, I think there is a middle class, a growing middle class, who has a growing role to play in political and social affairs. Actually, it is the class more interested and more concerned in the process of improving the democratic system. And thanks to this growing middle class, we could manage this sort of social and political sandwich in which we have lived between the status quo, the social inertia of a small but very powerful minority, and the growing discontent but social inability of a growing and very inarticulate majority.
What percentage of the Brazilian population would you say belong to the middle class?
To begin with, I don't believe in Brazilian statistics, so I'm very cautious about this. But I would say that the middle class should be judged as such, not only in terms of how much of their per capita income, but rather in terms of their psychological behavior, or their aspiration, their mentality, their way of living, and their way of trying to live. In that sense, the majority of the Brazilian workers, and I mean industrial workers, being comparatively new as a class, have definitely a mind, a mentality of a middle class petit bourgeois. And this, I think, is a very healthy thing, and many people who sometimes write about these things here don't take that in consideration.
Well, are they the
we don't
ones...
have the angry, bitter worker like Marx described in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, like he count on. No, for a good and simple reason. These fellows, they compare themselves with what they were a few years ago, or they compare themselves with the lives of their fathers, and they do realize that they improve. They have a sense of promotion, a sense of social mobility, which is going pretty fast.
Well, are they the ones who are most hurt by inflation, as is commonly
They
suggested?
they were not hurt by inflation. They actually
Because
were
their wages
promoted by
are that
inflation,
mobile?
and now they are hurt by deflation. They came from a sort of a trip to prosperity, if I may use that word. I mean, inflation was like LSD for them. They just got this trip, and all of a sudden they were deprived of it, and they fell down in the middle of a hole of depression in all senses. Depression in the sense of frozen salaries, depression in the sense of losing faith, depression in the sense of losing freedom to organize and even to protest against that. So then the danger begins. But I think there is a lot of phony propaganda in presenting the Brazilian worker and like a a group of desperados trying to make communism available. This belongs to an old tactic of politicians who used to come here, and like they did in so many places in the world, and blackmail your government, saying if you don't give us dollars, we'll go wide and call the communists.
Well, by way of summing up, Governor Cerda, may I ask this, if it's public information, do you intend to run for president?
Well, they say I intend to, and I don't deny that.
Is it true that you have an alliance with Kubitschek and Goulart?
Yes, we did make an alliance with Kubitschek and Goulart, but not for me to run for president. To fight for a popular vote who was suppressed in Brazil. They transformed it in an indirect vote, which is sort of an alliance between the military regime and old oligarchs who survived through this bargain.
Now,
we want the people
Mr.
to make the decision.
Mr. Goulart and Mr. Kubitschek have lost their political liberties.
For 10 years, yes.
Yes,
And without the right to defend themselves, which I think was basically a wrong thing.
You would not have. You never sanctioned the deprivation of political liberty.
No, not on that point.
Well, then
if they were deprived of their rights after a Jew trial, was the right to defend themselves.
What kind of coalition can you have with people who have no political rights?
But they
What
You
can
have
they throw
been
into
watching
the-
William
have
F. Buckley
thousands.
Jr. on his program, Firing Line. Our thanks to Mr. Buckley, to his guest, Carlos Lacerda, and our audience, including several members of the political science classes of Rutgers University. This has been Firing Line, William F. Buckley Jr.